Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to this segment of Coach Gurbani's a-sabad-a-day. Our recitation continues from Gauri Mahalla Panjwa. Jaka meet Sajan hai Samia, tis jan ko kaho kaa ki kamiyan. Jaki preet gobind syo lagi, dukh dard paramata ka bhagi. Rahao जाको रस हर रस है आयो, सो अनरस नाही लपटायो. जाका कहया दरगह चले, सो किसको नदर ले आवे तले. जाका सब किछ ताका होए, नानक ताको सदा सुख होए. A brief passage that talks about connecting through Gur Sabad with that one that is otherwise inaccessible to the senses. And the Guru begins by reminding us that Jaka meet Sajan hai Samia. This is Janako kaho ka ki kamiyan. Tell me, he says, what lack can be felt by that devotee whose friend is the all-pervading beloved. In other words, when that immutable wisdom is experienced, then all else is added unto the mind, or its absence is not felt. And therefore, Jaki preet gobind syo lagi, dukh dard paramata ka bhagi. Those who live in loving awareness of the Master of the universe, Gobind, give flight to their sorrows, pains, and delusions. What this means is that our current state, the restricted, constricted experience of the ego, is the underlying delusion that we suffer from, because it leads to body identification, it leads to identification with the senses, and then what happens is you are really dragged by the nose, by the senses. So an awakening is in order. Jaki preet gobind syo lagi. To be in love with Gobind is simply another way of saying to acquire, to become in that consciousness of Gobind, universal consciousness. Not to see things in isolation, but to view things holistically, to have that experience, not to see the obvious. For instance, when we see a bird fly, to be able to see at the potential of flying, to see the potential behind things, not to just read them or understand them on the surface. That is really what is meant by Preet Gobind Singh. Because remember, we live in the world of the senses and in a material world, and yet, the Gurus have adoringly sung to a reality that is not of the senses. They have challenged radically our perception of the ordinary world. They've called it untrue, unreal, fleeting, transitory. That is not easy to accept, because that flies in the face of how we perceive the world. And so therefore, this path calls for a complete and radical inversion of how we see things. And that is what is meant by Preet Gobind Singh. To be able to sense and perceive the reality behind what is concrete. And those who are able to do that, Jako ras har ras hai ayo, so anaras nahi lapatayo. Here's the key. Those who experience that consciousness are able to free themselves from the tyranny of the senses. They no longer cling to the senses. What is meant by that is, ordinarily what happens to us is that when we experience pleasure, we want to repeat it. And that repetition can degenerate into cravings, addictions, and the attendant unhappiness that they bring. So what we have to do when we experience this consciousness is we understand the senses and the desires that we have for what they really are, fleeting. That doesn't mean that we abdicate them or run away from them, but we understand their true nature. In other words, we understand that we live in a world of opposites, that desire for pleasure will bring with it pain. Opposites. Realizing this alone, just realizing this, sets the ground for liberation. Because you understand that in the world that we live, in the sensory world, things move. We are in duality. There is duality. So pleasure has the seeds of pain in it. When you begin to understand this, obviously the hold of desires begins to wane. And that's the whole point, that we do not wish to be slaves to our desires, but masters of our desires. We seek pleasure, then we seek it as a master and a cynosure of pleasure, not as a slave. Jaka kahya dargah challe, so kisko nadar le aave tale. When you experience that state of consciousness, one becomes self-assured, one becomes independent, does not need to look to others. Why should we look to others, the Guru says, if we can reach out to that whose writ runs the universe? Think about it. If the master of the universe is your friend, why would you need to look out to anybody else? Clearly, you wouldn't. Jaka sab kuch taaka hoye, nanak taako sad sukh hoye, and here's the key. So therefore, submit yourself not to another human, but to the master of the universe. Attach yourself to the master of the universe, attune yourself to the master of the universe, and in that way remain in bliss. On that note, until the next time, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.